It's fascinating. I want to ask another question about your work as a biographer. The previous book to the Vanderbilt effort was Jesse James, Last Rebel of the Civil War.
Hmm.
And even more than Vanderbilt, Jesse James has established such a mythical status in American history. What were your goals in presenting the biography on James, especially considering that there had been this sort of fictional legacy via Hollywood of James in the American experience?
Well, on one hand, as with Cornelius Vanderbilt, I wanted to get at, as much as I could, the person who was there, that to get beyond the icon and get at the real flesh and blood person. This is important in both Jesse James and Vanderbilt because, the serious discussions of them and their significance tends not to take you into their inner worlds. And it was actually easier with Vanderbilt because Jesse James was a fugitive his entire life. He didn't leave a journal. Dear diary, today I'm going to rob this bank.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't leave behind much of a written record. Vanderbilt, much more so, is able to get a little bit further into that personal life, his tortured family life, for example. But with Jesse James, I was trying to find those large themes that his life was about, and those large themes were the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction, the consequences of this terrible war the United States had undergone. That actually began by taking seriously what Jesse James himself had written. He was not the boss of his gang, not until the very end of his life. He was one among equals. His brother Frank, the younger brothers, they were a small group and they sort of operated collectively. What distinguished Jesse James among his fellow outlaws was that he deliberately wanted public attention. And when you read his letters to the press, they're all about the Civil War, Reconstruction. There's one famous letter that he's believed to have written after a high-profile robbery of the Kansas City Fair, carried out in front of tens of thousands of people. And he wrote a letter to the press which mentioned, we rob the rich and give to the poor. So that's used as evidence in the past by other historians to show that Jesse James is a Robin Hood figure. The full sentence says, when people call me a robber, I feel like they're lumping me in with Grant and the radical Republicans. Don't identify me with Grant. They rob everybody and keep it themselves. At least we rob the rich and give to the poor. So that claim to Robin Hood legacy is actually within the context of an extremely political letter. He actually ends the letter by urging his readers to vote for Grant's opponent in the 1872 election. So, because historians kind of come into these things and biographers come in with these presuppositions, certainly I do too, but the question is, can you challenge your own presuppositions? Can you see what's there in the evidence and then say to yourself, you know what, my thoughts, my view of this person has to go in a different direction. And what I did was try to see what was Jesse James trying to say, not how do we, find evidence for our pre-existing assumptions, but what was he really trying to say? And what were people thinking when they supported him? So, for example, there was a farmers' movement, the Grangers, and there was an agrarian party in Missouri after the Civil War, and they made a point of condemning the outlaws. They didn't see them as defenders of the small farmer, and they were upset at railroads, but they weren't supporting the small farmer. Jesse James was getting support, though, from former Confederates in a state that had been divided farm by farm, in which there had been a terrible guerrilla war. So, it's a dramatic story, like Vanderbilt's story. There's physical action, there's the threat of death, there's high stakes conflicts, and yet what we see in their lives are these big themes that we're still living with today about what America is all about.
It's just fascinating. It's too bad that Jesse James didn't have a political blog back then. I think that would have been an interesting read.
Yeah, I think so.
Finally, I want to talk about libraries. With all the research that you have to do for these biographies, how important is access to library information for you? And just more in general, how have you used libraries in your life and appreciated them as public resources?
The library is really where kids get contact with books, where they start to think about literature. It starts small, but that exposure to books, that exposure to literature, I really think is critical. And I think it's because, the long form narrative does something, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that Wikipedia doesn't do, that a Google search doesn't do. By immersing yourself both in a story and also in information over the course of hundreds of pages, you get a nuanced, textured depth of understanding and a nuanced, textured experience that you can't get from other forms of media. I'm no Luddite. I mean, I think the internet's a wonderful thing, but at the same time, it sometimes leads to assumptions that somehow it'll kill off the book, which is what we thought about radio and what we thought about the movies and we thought about television. The book survives because it is this wonderful thing. Libraries are at the center of our culture because the book remains at the center of our culture. And that's the kind of culture I want to have. And I think that most people do too.
Well, thank you very much for those passionate thoughts on libraries. Congratulations on all the well-deserved acclaim for The First Tycoon, your biography on Vanderbilt, and thanks for being a part of the Get Lit series.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in, and make sure to tune in regularly to Get Lit. You'll meet all sorts of Bay Area authors. Thanks for watching.